Back in business. All right. Let's see. Okay, so we are recording. Perfect. Go back to my screen here. All right. All right. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. It's never fun. Hopefully they can get it fixed by next week. Okay. All right. So we're talking about common goods. What are common goods?
Common goods are like goods that people can use free of charge, but it's in limited supply. So like natural resources and such.
Absolutely. That's great. So you have common goods, right? You think about individuals hunting, right? Or fishing, or the use of state and national parks, right? So that they're not developed, or we don't have this deforestation going on everywhere, right? So they're limited, right? You don't have state and national parks everywhere. You can't just continue to hunt unregulated, can't continue to fish, because what would happen, right? Those people that have a profit motivation to go out and fish, if you let them, they're going to continue to fish, and they're going to continue to fish and fish until, right, you're going to have a point to where you're going to be overfished, and there's not going to be anything else. The livelihoods of a lot of individuals are going to be impacted for generations to come. All right, so great job, Morgan. Right, so the government has a role in protecting those resources. Right, that's the reason you get hunting licenses, you get fishing licenses, and right, hunters and those that fish, they understand this. Right, that's important. Right, they want to be able to continue to go out time and time again. Those that want to use state and national parks, this is important to ensure that these things are protected. So the private sector doesn't own it, right? The government really doesn't own it. I mean, you have state and national parks, and they do, I mean, there's some ownership there, but I mean, the land itself, I mean, it's always been there. But it's there, it's the government's role to protect it. So great job, right? All right, so we've talked about our system of government, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, and then that'll kind of lead into our conversations about the Constitution and where we see our role in government, our relationship with government kind of spelled out. So in this country, we have a significant role to play. All right, where we've talked about a system of government, doesn't always feel that way, and I understand that, but a system of, by, and for the people. Right? We have a role to play. We have a responsibility to elect leaders, to hold our leader. I don't like to use the word leaders. Think of representatives. So we elect our representatives. We have to hold our representatives accountable. And if they're not doing their job, we need to vote them out. But it's not just about elections either. You need to have your voices heard. You can reach out to you're a member of the city council, or anybody on the city council, state legislators, the governor in your state, other constitutional offices, members of Congress, the Senate, the White House, right? There's a lot of pressure points where you can contact individuals and exert influence on what policy is being created before and after elections, right? That's where we see interest groups, lobbyists working to influence that policy. So we have a role to play, not just in elections, but in all parts of developing public policy, right? So individuals get involved in the process, organizations, corporations, all provide input, right? So democracy, what, if we were to look at just a kind of pure democracy, like look at the kind of pure definition of democracy, what is democracy?
It's a political system in which people govern themselves.
Okay, so we have that. So, right, people make decisions, you're governing yourself, right? So you, decisions are made, right, with the people involved in the process, right? What is this idea of pure democracy? What happens in like a pure democracy? What do we think of when we think of democracy? Normally what comes to mind, at least for me, a lot of individuals, is majority rule, right? Do we have majority rule in this country? What is majority rule? What do you think? When I say majority rule, what do you think about? Do we have it in this country?
Whoever gets the most, whoever gets the most backup or votes wins in any
Right.
situation.
So you said, who's the majority, right? How do you figure out a majority, right? There's a process for figuring out a majority. Where do the majority stand? 50% plus one, right? And whatever 50% plus one decides, that's the rule. That's the law, right? Do we live in a pure democracy?
No.
No, we don't. Why not?
Because the people we elect representatives, we don't actually there's other things that we don't fully vote for. So it's not a pure democracy.
Absolutely. So I'm going to get to that direct democracy, and we're talking about representative democracy versus direct democracy. And that's an important point. So hold that thought, Morgan. We're going to talk about that. But do we live in a system where in every issue, it's whatever they vote on, as long as you get 50% plus one, no matter the issue, it passes and that's fine, right? That's the law of the land. As long as a entity or a governing body or individuals voting on something, as long as you can get 50% plus one, that policy is enacted. Do we have a system of government like that? Got a thumbs up from Bree. And it sounds right on its face, right? And we're going to talk about why that's not the case. But if I brought that question up to a lot of people, they'd say, yeah, right? Majority rule, right? We have to have, right? There has to be a system for deciding something, right? Why not majority rule? And you're right, Bree, in part that we do have majority rule systems in this country. Part of the rules of the game in government, there has to be majority rule at some point. Sometimes there's super majority. So at some point we have to say, okay, the majority of our representatives, the majority of maybe the individuals that vote directly on something, we'll talk about direct democracy in a second, but we have to decide it based on majority rule. But the one thing that sets this country apart, and others as well, but it's not a pure democracy where you get mob rule, right? Where if the majority of people say, yeah, I want to take Mike's bike. Well, do you have 50% plus one? We sure do. All right, you get Mike's bike. All right. We have majority rule systems in this country, but we have minority rights, right? We talk back with life, liberty, and property. What are those foundational values? What's important, right? Where the individual is important in our system of government and our economic system. Well, in our government system, when the individual is important, if you're in the minority, you still have rights, right? Think about that. You have the right to property. You have the right to your speech, right? And we'll go through when we get to the civil liberties, we'll talk about the Bill of Rights and all the things that are laid out there. The limits of what government cannot do. It doesn't matter if you had 99 out of 100. If you're that one guy, and those people said, I want to take your bike, it doesn't matter because it's my property. I get to keep it, right? So in our constitutional republic, our representative democracy, we have not only systems of majority rule because you have to make decisions somehow, but there's things that the majority can't do. There's limits placed on the majority. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, getting back to Morgan's point, right? Most of our government systems in this country operate on representative democracy. So local level, school boards, city councils, state, right, counties, all the way up to the federal government. There's individuals that we elect that make decisions on our behalf. Now but that doesn't mean that that's how all the decisions are made. There's instances of direct democracy in which we vote ourselves, right? So has anybody heard of a ballot initiative or ballot referendum? right? Where you go and vote on something about a particular tax, right? Do you want to institute this tax or not? Should the local park district or school board be able to go out and sell bonds to raise money for a project? Yes or no, right? Those are, you see those a lot. So in direct democracy, you have a direct say. You're not working through a representative. You have a direct say in how those decisions are made. Okay? Where are those decisions usually made, right? If you had to think about where would it be best for direct democracy to be carried out? What level of government or what issues would direct democracy be most beneficial? What do you think? You had to think about individuals getting together and making decisions directly instead of through representatives. Where would that be? Where would that system be best applied?
Like electing our president.
So the president of the United States?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and we do have that. But what about policy? And I understand where you're coming from, but what about public policy? Right. So electing a president, right? You have to find a way to elect a president, right? Or other elected officials, which it is, right? Another instance of not the president so much, right? Because we'll talk about the electoral college, but every other representative, it's majority or more accurately plurality. But when we talk about voting on public policy, would we want to vote on public policy directly? Like a national public policy? And here's what I'm getting at. When you have these national complex policies, right, or just the daunting operational component logistics side of voters in this country getting together to vote on a national issue, right? You're going to have a lot of people coming from a lot of different areas, right? There's going to be, it's just going to be very complicated to get a large group of voters together to vote on a national issue, right? Where do you go to vote on the issue? What if it's an emergency and you need to vote quickly? Can we do that? What typically happens is often in some states, it's handled at the state level, but most often these referendums, these initiatives are done at the local level. Why are they done at the local level? Well, the local issue, at the local level, many communities, different parts of counties, different areas of a state, they can be very homogenous, right? There were people live in a particular area, they have a particular subculture, political subculture, they share a lot of the same values. So when they vote on issues at the local level, they're not as contentious. They can be, but they're not as contentious because there's a lot of homogeneity, right? A lot of values that are shared amongst the local population, right? You start to branch out across the state or across the country, it gets more complex and it's a lot more difficult to solve those kind of problems with direct democracy. But all very good thoughts. Well done. Oh, where are we going? All right. So different types of government. I'll just kind of quickly contrast this. You can read about this in the text. We don't have to go through them in detail, but you can compare our representative democracy, where we have a stake in who represents us. We have free, fair, and regular elections, to a monarchy where you have a hereditary ruler, right? That hereditary ruler, right? If you're not in that line of succession, it's not going to happen, right? And that monarchy, depending on the country, can be limited or unlimited. Many countries, you have shared power between the monarchy and a representative republic, right? The UK is one example, and where you have parliament, but you also have a monarchy, and they have different roles to play in their system of government. And then an oligarchy, where you have a lead or one-party rule. Usually, those elites rule. They make decisions to benefit themselves, right? Make it harder for individuals to break into that party, and really pits the elite up against kind of the common man, right? The the governed versus the elite. And then you have totalitarianism, where it's complete control, right? You have a dictator that essentially decides where people can live, what they do for a living, how much of their money they can keep, what they eat, you name it, right? Total is just that, right? Think of a country like North Korea. That would be a totalitarian state, right? So you think about just who's making the decisions, and we're going to talk about that in just a second here. But so who rules that? So we kind of know who rules in these other systems, and we know in theory who's supposed to rule in our country, right? The people. Does it always work out that way? And we'll talk about that, right? So who rules in America, right? So there is this, there's several theories about who rules in America, who ultimately makes the decision. Yes, we go through the election process, a campaign, people put out issues, but who's running? Who actually holds these seats, right? Who is financing these campaigns? And is it really, do those individuals really represent everybody? So on this idea, this kind of idealistic view of who rules in America, you have this idea of majoritarianism, right? And it's a political theory that holds that in a democracy, the government ought to do what the majority of people want. Sounds great, right? That's how it's supposed to operate. But does it always feel that way? Can anybody give an example of when it might not feel that way? Has anyone, let's just make it easy. Has anyone felt like their voices weren't being heard? You don't have to tell me the issue, but recently, has anybody felt like on a particular issue, like I said, don't have to share the issue unless you want to, that your voice isn't being heard or policy isn't being enacted that you think should be?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we feel like that, right? Depending on where we live. Are we in the majority in that area, right? Or are we in the minority, right? It's hard to be, where you might live in a place where you might not share the values of the majority, so the public policy you want is not being instituted and implemented. So you might feel like your voice is kind of being drowned out. That's just one particular example, but we have a lot of civil discourse in this country. And why? Because people feel, and like I said, there's a lot of, it's not this simple, right? But to put it in just straightforward terms, people don't feel that their voices are being heard. So they find other ways to make their voices heard. It could be to create an organization to lobby Congress. It could be, right, create an organization to recruit candidates that are in line with your ideology. There's a lot of different things that can be done. But, all right, so we think about why people engage, right? Think about age, right? If you're an 18 to 30-year-old, the chances of you being a regular voter, statistically, right? I'm just talking about statistically. Everybody's different on an individual level, but just from a statistic standpoint, younger people don't vote. So how can they be represented? Partisanship, ideology. You might live in a place, right? We oversimplify issues like red state, blue states, but what if you live in a place where you don't see eye to eye with those that are making those decisions, or the majority of individuals that are representing people or electing people to the state legislature or Congress? How do you go about that, right? You might live in a district where there's really no competition, right? Where a Democrat always wins and no Republicans ever won, or vice versa. The issues that you find important might never come up. You think about wealth, right? You have people that are coming from elite universities holding positions in government. You look at the race, the wealth of individuals holding seats in Congress, right? It's out of whack with, it doesn't reflect the makeup of the country. So can we really have that? And that's a bigger question, but I'm just raising that issue, and that's kind of the question. And so majoritarianism has kind of been thrown out as like, yeah, it's great. in theory, sure, sounds great, right? It's what we want, but is that realistic? And scholars have said, well, no, that's not real. That's not realistic. What we have is elitism, right? We've heard and talked about oligarchs and elites, but in this country, right, we're talking like this elite theory where society is ruled by a small number of people who exercise power. And it's not always the same people. There's new people coming into that system all the time, right? Again, Ivy League schools, they're wealthy individuals that, find themselves in places where they can make policy, and they differ at least on policy issues, or they don't necessarily reflect where the country stands, right? So we have, give me 1 second, guys. All right, sorry about that. Had my screaming 2-year-old come into the room. So, but that's life. Sorry about that. So we were talking about elitism, right? So is that really, so you compare majoritarianism, kind of that theoretical ideal, right? Then we have this elitism, and that rang true for a lot of individuals, right? Where they're the elites, right? We kind of have the same kind of makeup of Congress or the state legislatures of the wealthy, well-educated, at least formal education individuals that continue to hold these seats of power. But then came along pluralists, right? With people like Robert Dahl and others with pluralist theory, and saying, well, yeah, how do you explain the times that the elites don't get their way? You would think that if elitism was accurate, the elites would always get their way. But elites have lost elections. Policies that elites want don't always get enacted. So how do you explain that? And the pluralists came up with a theory that says majoritarianism, right? We're on that train, right? It's not accurate, right? It's an idealistic view of our system of government, but elites don't get everything that they want, right? So there's this kind of compromising view of who operates the levers of government. And pluralist theory kind of looks at decisions, right? The politics, the decisions that are being made as a conflict among interest groups, right? So, and so how does that factor into individuals being represented? Well, even if you're not part of an interest group, chances are there are interest groups that are lobbying Congress and other governmental bodies on your behalf. Can anybody think of maybe share an example of an organization that you're not a part of, but you like what they stand for? Anybody? How about, but you think about this, and you don't have to share it, but think about the things that are important to you. Maybe it's the environment. Maybe it's the Second Amendment. Maybe it's low taxes. Maybe it's abortion, right? All of these things. Do you have to be a member of the NRA to get the benefits of the NRA's work? No. Do you have to be a member of the AARP to get the benefits of their activities when it relates to lobbying Congress? No. If you're a senior citizen, whatever the AARP is successful in achieving that might benefit you, right? You don't have to be a member, right? So it kind of goes along this idea that there's competing interests, right? Whether you're directly involved or not, you have interests that are out there competing on your behalf, right? And what comes from that? It's bargaining and compromise. So you have this trade-off, all these trade-offs. And you trade off on the level of taxes. You trade off on, like I say here, what Congress is able to pass. And we're seeing that now. We see that all the time, right? We're saying, okay, just right along party line votes. You would think if a party has a majority, they can get anything through, but it's not always the way it works, right? It's a lot more complicated than that, right? So there's Democrats that are progressive, that are liberal, that are more moderate. You have libertarians that are Republican, that you have conservatives, you have more moderates, right? So you're trying to get all of those individuals on the same page, right? You have interest groups lobbying them. And so you have this push and pull. So policy is not clean, the process isn't clean, and doesn't always benefit the elite. So keep those in mind. So you have majoritarianism, elitism, and pluralism, kind of that trade-off perspective, right? These competing groups working on basically representing all the different values and interests of the citizens of this country, okay? All right, any questions before we move on to chapter 2? Any questions for me? All right, so take these ideas, right? We're going to take these values, the things that we've talked about, right? The focus on the individual, what's important, right? These kind of God-given kind of civil liberties that we'll talk about more in detail, because as an individual, you have a right to pursue your own happiness. You have a right to property, right? You can speak your own mind. You can redress government, redress your grievances with government, right? So all of these things that you are able to do as an individual, right, are going to be spelled out, or at least identified in the Constitution and the lead up to the Constitution. You're going to kind of see these values, these ideals, these beliefs. Basically, the colonists lived these beliefs and ultimately enacted them in the Articles of Confederation and ultimately the U.S. Constitution. All right. So we've talked a little bit about this with John Locke, this idea of the social contract, right? So it's a theory of politics that asserts that individuals form political communities by a process of mutual consent. So it's individuals coming together to make decisions about saying, okay, we live in a society, we want certain things out of society, right? When we talk about society, we have to have a process, we have to institute the rules of the game, the institutions. What are those institutions going to look like? What are going to be the rules? And what's going to be the power that those institutions have? And so social contract theory posits that people come together, they know government's necessary. Oh man, we're going to get kicked off again. So just bear with me until I can get this fixed. Log back in 10 minutes if we get booted out. This is very aggravating, as I'm sure it is for you, but I'll make sure I push harder to get this fixed by next week. If not, we'll find another solution so that we can stay on and go right through. So individuals come together, say government's necessary because some of the things that several of you have already said, right? Government has a role in protecting my property. I don't want people to come steal my property, my horses, my cows, these kind of things, right? So I have a right to have these things protected. So I'm willing to give government a certain amount of power to ensure that I get a certain amount of security, right? And we'll talk about kind of this, if you think about the ideological spread of individuals in this country, right? From progressives, libertarians, conservatives, liberals, moderates. Usually that's social contract. You can tie that back because you're looking at what your willing to let government do, how much liberty you're willing to give up, right? You have liberals, progressives willing to give up more liberty for a certain level of security. Conservatives not as willing to give up liberty for whatever level of security they're looking for. And libertarians, right, almost, right, as limited government as possible, right, limiting government's power, right, not willing to give up a lot of liberty. So you can usually find your place on that spectrum based on this kind of idea of the social contract, right? What are you willing to give up in order to get a certain amount of security from government institutions, right? John Locke and others wrote about natural rights, right? Life, liberty, and property. Instead of, right, you have this divine, moving on from this idea of the divine right of kings, right? The kings that had this divine intervention to make decisions, and whatever they said was right, and we had to abide by them, right? Social contract theorists threw that out, said, no, we all have natural rights. They're God-given, we're born with them. No man has the ability to make decisions to take those rights away, right? We're all individuals, and basically human beings have reason. All human beings have reason, and we need the power has to lie with the individuals. We see remnants of this. We see this kind of show up in the Magna Carta with King John. The big difference, and I've had students mention the Magna Carta before, the big difference between the Magna Carta and, say, the US Constitution is, right, the fact that after King John, even though he made that agreement, subsequent monarchs could rescind that agreement at any time, right? It's essentially, okay, you have the right to do something until I say you don't, right? In our system, that power is retained by the people, regardless of who is representing us at any particular level of government, right? Okay, and then we also see, we can trace back language and ideas from the Constitution back to the English Bill of Rights as well. So these issues evolved during the Age of Enlightenment, moving forward to say, okay, look, how should we be thinking about human beings and how they should be able to make their own decisions, decide their own destinies, and moving on from there. Right? All right, so now these are ideas, and now they're playing out in the colonies with we have the American Revolution. We have individuals that were separated, right? They're colonists on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, right? Not a lot of oversight by King George, right? Not a lot of oversight by England, right? So they got used to governing themselves, solving problems themselves. And they like this idea. And this idea of the social contract and the aspects of the social contract seeped into their culture, right? We have the ability, we have the right to decide what's best for us, to govern ourselves. And so that seeped in. And leading up to the American Revolution, we saw this pushback, right? This push and pull from England, pushing on the colonists pushing back with the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, right? All of these acts right? England, the king, wanted to reap the rewards of having, being English, the colonies being under English control, right? Bringing money back to England, and making sure that England, anything that the colonists benefited from, the crown would benefit from as well, right? And then you see this pushback, right? Colonists responding with boycotts to English products and protests, right? And then you had the First Continental Congress. And the First Continental Congress was, right, I mean, when we talk about John Locke and reason, and the idea of the human beings are rational. They're able to reason. That's really what the First Continental Congress was about. We're going to England and saying, look, these are our concerns, right? This is what's happening. You're violating such and such, right? Our ability to earn a living, our this, taxation without representation. We need to change how we're doing things. We want to change this arrangement. The colonists weren't eager to go out on their own. They weren't looking to say, let's just completely break ties with England. They wanted to come up with another solution. Well, of course, that didn't work. And the king pushed back harder and said, no, right? These colonists are getting real cocky, right? Who are they to say this, right? We give them protection. They went out on our behalf, and now they don't appreciate us, and they want to govern themselves, and they don't want to pay taxes, and they want representation. Forget these guys. So more taxes and more regulation, right? I'm going to post a link to a dramatic reading of the Declaration of Independence tomorrow. And what I want you to do is read that. It's done by celebrities, right? Some of those celebrities in there that have, this was put out, the video was put out there a bunch of years ago. So some of the celebrities have been in trouble, legal trouble since then, but try not to let that be your focus. When you listen to that, or go out and read the Declaration of Independence on your own if you haven't read it in a while, and you read like the preamble, and that's important, right? Because it lays out kind of this rationale of why they should govern themselves. But then you go beyond that and you look at the reasoning, right? What are the grievances that the colonists had with England? And that's really where you get down to say, okay, what was England really doing where the colonists said, we have no choice but to push back, right? So the king wasn't having it. Second Continental Congress came together, right? And so look, May 1775, right? They're getting together, they're planning all this, right? And then you get the Resolution of Independence on July 2nd, 1776, and then the formal Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, right? And then ultimately, in 1781, Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, right, ending the Revolutionary War. The colonists successfully won their freedom, and Britain recognized U.S.'s independence in 1783. So the question is, all right, we're less than a minute now, so just get ready to log back on. So now what, right? So you have this situation in where these colonists, they wanted their freedom, but there was a part that's like, right, with the First Continental Congress, they didn't want to separate from England. They wanted to have their issues resolved, but they found they had no other choice. But now look, right? What do we do now? How do we go about keeping this country together, to governing ourselves, right, without kind of that protection of England? Right? All right. So first thing we're going to talk about, we have to talk about, obviously, because this is the first shot, the first attempt the colonists had at